Hey everybody, today I'm going to be reviewing There Will Be Blood. This film was written and directed by Paul Thomas Anderson. Somebody asked me, and I can't remember who it was, somebody commented on one of my videos and said, why haven't you reviewed any Paul Thomas Anderson movies? And I thought to myself, I have no idea. I didn't even consider that, and I decided that has to change. So I thought I would just go with my favorite PTA movie of all time. He started off in the 90s as somebody that was establishing himself as a really great auteur director, particularly with Boogie Nights and Magnolia. Both films had very strong, very aggressive styles that drew heavily from the influence of other directors. For instance, Martin Scorsese, in terms of kind of the editing, the flow of it, the montage with the music, how it really captured a certain zeitgeist. And I think it also drew heavily from Robert Altman in the sense that you have these really big ensemble casts that are reflecting what's socially relevant. There Will Be Blood is actually quite a big departure from what we had known from PTA up to that point, and I think it's a very subtle, very somber film with this undercurrent of just coiled tension, and there's a lot of dissonance that draws out a lot of the complexity from the simplicity of the film. It's a very focused film, it has a very small cast, and Daniel Plainview is at the center of that story. There Will Be Blood has a lot of the same themes that you see in a lot of the great American landmark films, a lot of the great epics. It's a cautionary tale that's warning people of the dangers of capitalism and greed. It's also about the rise and the eventual destruction of a big tycoon in the kind of Charles Foster Kane sense. And I think that's why so many people are fascinated by it, because that really is the foundation of what our country is built on. I think it's very important to mention that this film does take place at the very beginning of the 20th century, so all of that machinery that was evolving in the Industrial Revolution has kind of become such a big, it's become so prominent in terms of business moguls, and it really begun to flourish. And again, that's so much of what we are as a nation. But you realize, while watching the film, how much of passion and drive is based on business. It's based on duplicity and anger, selfishness that just builds with this ferocity. But I also like how the film brings out a lot of that eccentricity that, in a way, almost borders on parody, which, you know, people may think it's far-fetched, but honestly, if you look at the election right now, it's really not. What I like so much about the film is the screenplay, and I don't think the screenplay gets enough credit. Yes, it is a very quiet film, but it uses that silence to its advantage, and it conveys all of this capitalism without really making those themes visible on the surface, and that's very, very hard to do. So much of what makes these characters tick and their motivations are very hidden, and they're only hinted at and conveyed through the way that they interact. I guess you could say Daniel's call to adventure, if you want to use more like traditional story terms, would be when he meets Eli Sunday, played by Paul Dano, and he's a young preacher that makes a deal with him to build a bigger church if Daniel buys the land and drills for oil. And the dynamic between the two characters is just that prime example of what I mentioned. You see that all of this passion that these two characters have is not really for furthering a good cause, and it's not for the benefit of anyone else other than themselves. It's about personal fulfillment and competition. Religion is a business in the same way that oil is a business. These two characters, the way that they go at it is really quite funny, but it's also extremely intense and fascinating because they are so similar. They're so primal and manic in their obsession. They are cut from the same cloth, and I think they absolutely recognize that in each other and in themselves. And that's where all that animalism kind of comes to the forefront. And I think within that inherent recognition of all of that in themselves, there's a sense of insecurity. They hate those characteristics in each other, and therefore they hate them in themselves. And I always feel that, especially in the character of Daniel, just this pain and this just a hint of insecurity that is lurking beneath this hard, calloused exterior. But you feel that darkness and that rage in him. And I love how it's brought out in the very discordant, very Herman-esque score that's written by Jonny Greenwood of Radiohead. It creates that paradox between the silence and the subtlety of the film. And in a way, it's like being able to look at kind of the interior of Daniel's mind without anyone ever having to say it. It's just all brought out in the music. I know there were some critics that did have some criticisms of the film. I don't know so much now because the film is such a classic at this point, but they had a problem with the way the film kind of builds and slowly ascends into, becoming, it starts out very tense and enigmatic and becomes more and more like a parody. It's very funny. And particularly with Eli and Daniel as the main characters, they just get so over the top that it's like they're about to burst into song at any point. But I love that personally. PTA has always had a sense of humor in his work, but I think that whereas you saw more of an influence from like Scorsese and Robert Altman earlier in his career, I think here you're seeing more of a Kubrick influence. And I think that a lot of that not only is in maybe the themes and the camera work, but it's also in the humor, because it's, when you watch a Kubrick film, the humor, like in A Clockwork Orange, for example, it's bizarre, it's strange. You don't know if you're supposed to be laughing at it or not. And it's the same way with this movie. It's almost like it's a very distant kind of cold humor, almost like you're examining the human experience, like as though they're specimens. It's an examination of just how primal we are as a species, and that beneath this civilized, conditioned exterior is this survival of the fittest need that we have, and that always wins over everything. But for me, the best thing about the film is the pathos, and that's just because that's the crux of the arc of Daniel Plainview as a character. And for me, that is absolutely most evident in the relationship between him and his son, H.W. A lot of people like to go with the idea that Daniel only uses his son kind of as the sympathy card for when he's trying to build his business and his success, and that he doesn't really love H.W. at all. But I don't know if I buy into that completely. I think that's too cut and dry. I think that if anything, H.W. is the only person who draws out even just a shred of humanity in Daniel. Daniel is one of the most horrible, selfish human beings there is, and I know that he has such a drive, but H.W. does mean something to him. Because trust me, if he didn't, he would not be there. And you do see that minor trace of sensitivity in just very little moments throughout the film between the two of them. And, you know, it may be for selfish reasons, because a lot of times when we love someone, it's usually, you know, for our own benefit, because we don't want to be alone. And that could definitely be true for H.W., because H.W. does belong to him, so he looks at him maybe as a possession or whatever. But it does, you know, give him some sort of humanity. It's just uncomfortable to watch, and it's very tragic to watch how the two of them kind of wedge that gap between each other. And, you know, because obviously Daniel's need for success and to build himself up successfully is much more important to him than any sort of human connection. Daniel Day-Lewis brings out all of those facets and more, and just I don't even have words for it. It is just, it's one of the greatest performances by a man or woman in the history of cinema, at least as far as I'm concerned. What this man is doing is something I have never seen done before by an actor. It's a very physical performance, an extremely detail-oriented performance in terms of just the little, you know, gestures and idiosyncrasies of the character in terms of just the way that he operates. But look into his eyes. They're full of depth. There is not a moment where you're not seeing the wheels turning, where you're not seeing some flicker, some sort of layer of complexity that is being added to this character. And a lot of people like to make fun of Daniel Day-Lewis because of how far he takes the method acting. But look at the result. I mean, he disappears. There is not a trace of the real Daniel Day-Lewis at all. It's like he was always the character. He is riveting at every millisecond. And the older that I get, the more I am moved by this performance. This character is a man that, as I said, obviously is very complex, and he channels his motivations in very, very unhealthy ways, rather than what should be meaningful to him, like connection and love. But that story is so familiar to so many of us, and I think a lot of people have that same story, which is why so many people end up alone. And even if you don't, you can certainly relate to that. There's a piece of that in all of us. That's why we are so materialistic, why we create these soulless corporations in order to fill our lives with things, with concepts of whatever success and business means to us, rather than finding that true sense of who we are as humans, because that is a lot more difficult to face. That's why I think the film is so interesting. It explores recognizable themes, again, that we've seen so many times in movies, especially Hollywood movies, but there's this intensity that is always right beneath the surface that I don't know has been quite captured in this way. There's a creativity about it. And it's also quite a hypnotic film. It just draws you in very, very slowly. There's kind of that strange quirkiness about it in the midst of the darkness. And to me, that's, again, the human experience. It's a little strange, it's a little funny, it's a little dark, but that is who we are as a collective, and yeah, I mean, it's a great film. There's a reason it's a classic. And that is my review. Thank you all for listening. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, the link is below. And you can also like my Facebook page, the link below that. Catch you next time.